The kitchen is hot, but the mystery is hotter. Welcome to Wolfe's Casebook. I am your host, Mr. Enigma. I want to know, where in the world are you listening from? Your comments light up this community. Now the story unfolds. I've seen people march into Nero Wolfe's office with all sorts of desperate faces. Guilty ones, grieving ones, greedy ones, and once a man who claimed his life depended on Wolfe identifying which of three sisters made the better sauerkraut. That one was memorable, mostly because Wolfe nearly threw him out with a verbal shove that landed harder than my own right hook could have. But that Wednesday afternoon, the man who walked in wasn't desperate. He was smug. You could tell it by the way he set his hat on the edge of Wolfe's big globe like he owned the place, and how he smiled at me before I even asked his name. His shoes were glossy enough to signal money, and his belly hinted at steady work with knives, butter, and cream. "My name," he said, "is Raymond Vukovich. You may have heard of me." Le Gant Rouge, I had. If you live in New York and you don't live exclusively on hot dogs, you know the name. Le Gant Rouge was one of those temples of cuisine where men in tuxedos carried plates like reliquaries, and women in pearls murmured about sauces I couldn't pronounce. I'd never set foot inside, but the gossip about its chef had drifted my way often enough. Ambitious, sharp-tongued, a perfectionist, Vukovich had been written up as both a genius and a tyrant, depending on who you asked. Wolfe, sitting in his chair behind his desk, did not open his eyes from the book he was reading. If you're new to this, I'll remind you that the chair was designed for no one else. The book was heavy enough to double as a murder weapon, and Wolfe's bulk was arranged in such a way that you knew he'd be there until either the end of the day or the end of the world. I introduced the chef and waited for Wolfe's grunt of acknowledgement. Nothing. Wolfe could make silence feel like a bouncer, holding you against a wall. Vukovich didn't wilt. He leaned closer, inhaled, and actually sniffed the air. Beef consommé, tarragon, a touch too much salt. That got Wolfe to lower the book. His eyes, black and unblinking, settled on the man as though he'd just insulted his ancestry. "It is not too much salt," Wolfe said. His voice was velvet laid over a stone wall. Vukovich smiled broader. "Then forgive me. My palate has been sharpened by 20 years of relentless training. Perhaps it plays tricks. Perhaps your tongue is too long," Wolfe replied. He closed the book with a sound like a judge's gavel. "State your business." The chef turned his attention back to me, as though we were the reasonable half of the room. "I am organizing what will be the most distinguished culinary challenge in New York history. A competition, invitation only, judged by critics, patrons, and peers. It is to be called the Chef's Challenge, and I require Mr. Wolfe's participation." That was good. I nearly dropped my pencil, which I'd been twirling. Wolfe competing in a cooking contest was about as likely as him entering a marathon in a pink tutu. Wolfe said nothing, which was his way of condemning the idea to hell without expending breath. Vukovich continued smoothly. "I don't mean for him to cook. His reputation is such that the event would be unthinkable without him. I need him as a judge. His standards are uncompromising. His knowledge of cuisine is legend. His presence alone will elevate the challenge above petty contests and make it history." I watched Wolfe. His eyelids didn't so much as flicker. If I'd been a betting man, and occasionally I am, I'd have wagered all of Le Gant Rouge's silverware that Wolfe was about to dismiss this fellow with one syllable, but instead, Wolfe said no, that was it. Vukovich nodded. As if expecting it, he reached into his pocket, pulled out an envelope and slid it onto Wolfe's desk with the elegance of a man presenting dessert. The envelope was thick. I knew what was inside without needing to peek. Expenses covered. Compensation beyond generous. Prestige unparalleled, Vukovich said. "You may remain here in your sanctum. We will bring the dishes to you if you prefer, but you must be involved. There are considerations that make you uniquely necessary." Wolfe's nostrils flared, which is his version of a double take. "Considerations?" "Let us call them potential sabotages. Rivalries among chefs can be intense. Too intense. A man of your stature could ensure fairness, or at least detect when it has been fouled. I shifted in my chair. There it was, the hook under the bait. Sabotage, rivalries, too intense. This wasn't just about bragging rights in the kitchen. You expect skullduggery, Wolfe said. I expect brilliance. And brilliance invites sabotage, Vukovic replied. His tone was light, but the weight behind it was heavy enough to stir Wolfe's interest. Wolfe drummed his fingers once on the armrest. Then he closed his eyes again. Leave your card. Archie will see you out. The chef bowed, retrieved his hat from the globe, and left without another word. I waited for Wolfe to dismiss it, to mutter about impertinence, to lecture me about the folly of public competitions. Instead, he sat there breathing, the envelope unopened on the desk, the silence stretching. Finally, I said, "You're not really thinking about it." "I am," he murmured. That was when I knew something had shifted. Nero Wolfe never volunteered for chaos. If chaos came to him, he endured it with the resignation of a mountain facing a storm. But this was him stepping forward, however slightly. Why? I didn't know then. But I could smell it, as surely as Vukovic had smelled the consommé. The brownstone was about to be disturbed. Wolfe let the envelope sit there on the desk, as though it had been dropped by a careless pigeon and might yet contain something unsanitary. I was tempted to give it a poke myself, but I knew better. That was Wolfe's ritual. When money, promises, or threats came his way, he preferred to ignore them until they either shriveled or grew too large to disregard. I've seen him let checks worth thousands gather dust for weeks while he read Plutarch. That envelope had the same fate written all over it. After Vukovic left, I perched on the arm of the red leather chair opposite Wolfe and tried to stir him. "You know, if you're thinking of taking this on, I should probably warn you. A kitchen full of egos is worse than a speakeasy full of drunks. At least the drunks know they're drunk. Chefs think they're gods." He didn't open his eyes. "Phoy, spare me your gastronomic sociology." I leaned back. "Fine, but you don't usually let a man hint at sabotage without biting. What is it? Your curiosity about whether these genius spoon-wielders will poison each other?" He opened his eyes then slowly and met mine. "It is the effrontery that intrigues me. The man presumed to appraise my seasoning. That he dared suggests not mere insolence but intent. He came here to provoke, and he succeeded. I should have seen it then. Vukovic hadn't just brought an invitation. He'd brought bait, laced with enough insult to stir Wolfe from inertia. Wolfe would have ignored a dozen envelopes stuffed with cash, but a challenge to his culinary authority? That was another matter entirely. Still, there was a gap to cross between being insulted in one's own office and consenting to let the brownstone be invaded by steaming dishes and ambitious chefs. I figured we had days, maybe weeks, before Wolfe made up his mind. That was when the doorbell rang. Fritz answered, and from the sound of shoes clicking into the hall, our guest wasn't shy about intruding. A moment later, in walked a woman whose coat alone was worth more than my yearly clothing budget. She had dark hair pinned too neatly to be accidental, eyes that scanned like she was taking inventory, and a mouth that didn't curve unless it wanted something. She introduced herself with a cool nod. "Celeste Armand." "I'm sure you know the name." I did, though I didn't advertise it. Armand was a critic, sharp, merciless, and known to destroy a restaurant with a single review. Her byline carried the sort of weight that could shut down a dining room overnight. She was also rumored to have driven more than one chef to breakdown. Wolfe, who considered critics to be both parasites and necessary vermin, merely inclined his head. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "I won't waste your time. You've been approached by Raymond Vukovic." I raised an eyebrow. News traveled fast in that world. "Too fast." "I have," Wolfe said. She stepped closer, unbuttoning her coat like she was preparing for a duel. "Then you must understand that the so-called chef's challenge is more than a competition. It is a battlefield. Vukovic intends to use it not only to crown himself emperor of New York cuisine, but to destroy rivals in the process, and I will not allow him to do so unopposed. I gave her my best polite grin. That's fascinating. But forgive me if I ask, what does any of this have to do with us? We don't exactly cater parties. Her eyes flicked to me, sharp as skewers, then back to Wolfe. You are the only man whose palate and authority he cannot dispute. If you agree to judge, he will be restrained. If you decline, he will run wild. I urge you to accept, but to do so with caution. He has enemies, yes, but he also has ambitions that extend far beyond the kitchen. Wolfe's lip curled slightly. Madam, I am not a governor to restrain a man's ambition, nor am I inclined to sit in a chair while a parade of pretentious concoctions is forced upon me. Celeste didn't flinch. No, but you are a man who despises deception, and Vukovich deals in it more readily than spices. That hit the nerve. Wolfe's shoulders shifted. The faintest twitch that told me he'd filed her remark under useful. She slipped a folded paper from her coat pocket and placed it beside the unopened envelope. The names of the other competitors. Read it or don't. But when you decide, remember that the challenge is more than food. It is war. With that, she left as abruptly as she came, leaving the faint scent of expensive perfume behind her. I whistled low. You realize what just happened? That's 2 visitors in under an hour. If this keeps up, we'll need to install turnstiles. The brownstone hasn't been this busy since that time Inspector Kramer barged in with half the homicide squad. Wolfe didn't answer. He was staring at the 2 items on his desk, the envelope of cash and the folded paper, like they were exotic fungi that might release spores if disturbed. I took the liberty of opening the paper. Let's see. The list includes Anton De Luca. He runs Trattoria del Mare, known for his temper, right? Then Madeleine Duval, French import, makes sauces that apparently reduce men to tears. Charles Harrington, society darling, loves publicity more than food. And finally a surprise entry. David Klein, never heard of him. Enough, Wolfe said. I set the paper down. So 4 suspects, if we're already thinking in those terms. Each with a motive to sabotage, if you believe the critic, which I sort of do because she delivered her warning like someone throwing down a gauntlet. Wolfe closed his eyes again. Archie, tomorrow morning you will pay calls on these individuals. Ascertain their dispositions, their rivalries, and whether they are capable of stooping to the pettiness that Vukovich anticipates. I grinned. That's the spirit. I'll dust off my tie and pretend I care about soufflés. He opened his eyes just enough to lance me with a glare. You will refrain from wit. This is not about soufflé. It is about power. In the kitchen, power is a subtler poison than arsenic. That was Wolfe in a nutshell. Give him politics, deceit, and ambition, and he was alert as a hound. Dress it in whipped cream and call it dessert, and he'd still sniff out the corruption. The next morning, I was on the street with my notebook, my best shoes, and the kind of curiosity that makes trouble unavoidable. The brownstone was already disturbed, and Wolfe hadn't even said yes yet. But I knew him too well. His curiosity had been piqued, his pride had been touched, and his sense of order had been challenged. He could resist money. He could resist prestige. But he couldn't resist a gauntlet, especially one delivered in the language of food. And somewhere beneath the steam and saucepans, someone was plotting a move that would force Wolfe to play their game. They didn't know it yet, but that was their first mistake. The first stop on my morning tour was Anton De Luca's Trattoria del Mare, tucked into a block that smelled of garlic, exhaust fumes, and ambition. The place was closed to customers at that hour, but through the front glass I could see a man berating a sous chef with the intensity of a general correcting a battle plan. When I rapped on the door, he turned, scowled, and motioned for someone to let me in. De Luca was short, broad, and sweating under his white coat, though it was barely 10 o'clock. He looked like a man who'd been born in front of a stove and had never learned to smile. I introduced myself, explained I was representing Nero Wolfe, and waited for the reaction. Wolfe? He spit the name like it was a lemon seed. The big one. He's judging this circus. I didn't say that, I told him. I said he's been invited. He hasn't agreed yet. De Luca snorted and wiped his brow with a towel. Then tell him this. If Vukovic thinks he can play games with me, he's mistaken. I have survived 20 years in this city's kitchens. 20 years, and now they say I must bow to him. Never. Funny he didn't mention you by name, I said. But since you bring it up, what makes you think he'll try to undercut you? De Luca's eyes flashed. Because he fears me. He knows my sauces are better, my seafood fresher. He has the critics in his pocket, but he cannot beat me honestly. So he will cheat. That is why he wants your wolf, to make the fraud look real. The sous chef tried to interrupt, and De Luca roared at him in Italian until the poor fellow retreated into the kitchen. Then De Luca stabbed a finger at me. Tell Wolfe, if he values truth, he must see through Vukovic's lies, or else there will be trouble. I didn't ask what kind of trouble. The man's eyes already told me he could throw a skillet with the aim of a pitcher in the World Series. I thanked him for his time, made a note in my book, and left before he decided I looked like a target. Next up was Madeleine Duval, whose restaurant on the Upper East Side was all pale curtains and hushed music. Unlike De Luca, she greeted me like I was a guest at her own table, tall, elegant, with a French accent as carefully balanced as her perfume. She took me into a quiet corner and offered coffee I couldn't refuse. You come from Monsieur Wolfe, she said, her eyes warm but searching. This is a relief. He is a man of taste, a man of integrity. If he judges, perhaps this foolish contest will not become the farce Vukovic intends. Everyone keeps bringing up Vukovic like he's plotting to poison the consommé, I said. Why not simply refuse to compete? Her smile faltered. Refuse? Impossible. If one refuses, one is forgotten. In this city, fame is fragile like a souffle. Vukovic knows this. He lures us in, then hopes to humiliate us. He will, how do you say, set a trap. Already he spreads whispers that Duval cannot handle pressure, that my sauces are too rich, too old-fashioned. He wishes to break me before the critics. Sounds like you don't trust him, I said. Trust him. She laughed softly. Mon Dieu, I would sooner trust a wolf with a lamb. But I must attend. My reputation demands it. That is why Monsieur Wolfe must be there, to keep Vukovic honest. I finished my coffee, thanked her for her hospitality, and promised nothing. 2 chefs down, 2 narratives of sabotage and deceit. I was beginning to see a pattern. Everyone agreed Vukovic was dangerous, but no one wanted to stay home. The 3rd visit was to Charles Harrington, whose establishment was less a restaurant and more a stage. Harrington himself met me at the door in a silk suit, hair slicked back, grinning like a man whose reflection was his best friend. Archie Goodwin, he said grandly, before I could even open my mouth. Yes, I know who you are. And I know Wolfe. What a delightful twist. Imagine, the great Nero Wolfe presiding over the greatest culinary duel of our time. How the papers will devour it. He led me inside, where waiters rehearsed carrying trays as though they were in ballet school. Harrington spoke like every word was written for a headline. This challenge will be my coronation, he announced. I have patrons, investors, society darlings. Vukovic thinks he can eclipse me? Ha! He underestimates the value of charm. He may have his knives and sauces, but I have influence. And if influence fails, I asked. He waved a jeweled hand. Then Wolfe will see the truth. A man so legendary cannot be deceived by petty tricks. That is why Vukovic courts him, you know, because only Wolfe can sanctify the victory. Without him, it's just another food fight. I thanked Harrington, though it was like thanking a circus barker for his noise. He seemed more dangerous with a camera than a knife. Still, his certainty that Wolfe's presence was vital told me plenty. The last name on my list was David Klein, tucked away in a modest bistro downtown. Unlike the others, Klein greeted me with no theatrics. He was young, pale, and nervous, with ink-stained fingers that suggested he spent more time sketching menus than cooking them. "You're here about the challenge," he said quietly, glancing around as if the walls might be listening. "That's right. I'm Archie Goodwin, working for Nero Wolfe. He swallowed hard. Then please, convince him not to take part. If he does, he'll be pulled into something ugly. I should never have agreed to compete. Vukovic insisted, said it would launch my career. But I think... He lowered his voice. I think he only wants me there to ruin me. To make me an example. An example how? I asked. Klein wrung his hands. He says there will be surprises in the judging. Blind tastings, hidden ingredients, sudden changes, tricks, and if I fail, everyone will laugh. My backers will leave. My restaurant will die before it lives. He looked at me with eyes that had too much fear for a man holding a ladle. Tell Wolfe, if he goes near this, he'll see things he doesn't want to see. That was my cue to exit before his nerves cracked any further. I left him with a handshake and returned uptown, my notebook thick with contradictions. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair, lips pursed, eyes half shut, as Fritz moved silently about with trays. I gave Wolfe my report in detail, leaving out nothing. When I finished, he opened his eyes fully, and his expression was the one I'd seen when a puzzle had crawled into his brain and refused to leave. So, he said, De Luca anticipates fraud. Duval anticipates humiliation. Harrington anticipates glory. Klein anticipates destruction. And all anticipate me. That's the gist, I said. They're a suspicious bunch, and Vukovic seems to be the common denominator. Of course, Wolfe murmured. He invited me to serve as both ornament and shield. But ornaments are fragile, and shields may crack. The impertinence. He laced his fingers, eyes narrowing. Archie, the brownstone is no longer undisturbed. Tomorrow I expect another visitor, possibly two. When the world intrudes, it rarely does so singly. Prepare yourself. I didn't doubt him. He had that tone, the one that meant he saw the shape of something I couldn't yet glimpse. Trouble had already set the table, and we were about to be served. The following morning arrived with that deceptive calm New York sometimes wears before it bares its teeth. Fritz had just set a tray of rolls on Wolfe's desk when the doorbell rang again. I was halfway down the hall before Wolfe's voice drifted after me. Low but certain, another one. He was right. Of course. I opened the door to find a man in a tailored grey suit, whose face was lined with the kind of precision only worry could etch. He introduced himself as Martin Corbett, a name I recognized from the financial pages. He had money in half the city's restaurants, including, if memory served, the hefty stake in Le Gant Rouge. He stepped inside with the air of someone used to buying whatever space he entered. Mr. Wolfe, he said when ushered into the office, I hope I can speak plainly. That depends, Wolfe replied, not looking up from buttering a roll. Platitudes nauseate me. Corbett sat, folded his hands, and got right to it. The challenge is not merely a culinary exhibition. Considerable investments ride on the outcome. Reputations will rise or collapse. If Vukovic wins, his value doubles. If he loses, mine does. So I need a safeguard. I leaned against the globe, arms folded. And you figure Wolfe is your insurance policy? Corbett's eyes flicked to me, then back to Wolfe. Precisely. Your integrity is unimpeachable. If you preside, no one can question the fairness of the result. I am willing to underwrite your participation at any figure you consider equitable. Wolfe's nostrils widened slightly, which in his world was a full grimace. Sir, I will not prostitute my palate for your profit. If I take part, it will not be to serve your ledger. Corbett stiffened. Then why consider it at all? Pride. The room went still. I could practically hear Fritz shifting uneasily in the kitchen. Wolfe set down his roll, his voice deepening. Pride is the armor of the fool. I consider it because effrontery came to my door and left its spoor on my carpet, and because duplicity insults me. That is all. Corbett inclined his head, conceding nothing, and stood. Then I urge you to think carefully, sir. Some of us have much at stake, and some of us do not forgive easily. He left without shaking hands. I turned to Wolfe. Friendly fellow. He'll be sending us Christmas cards. Pooh, Wolfe muttered. Another parasite clinging to ambition. Archie, note. Corbett's presence confirms that this affair is not about food but about dominion. I jotted it down, though what I really noted was the tightening coil in Wolfe's tone. The brownstone had become a magnet, drawing in not just chefs and critics but financiers. Hand magnets, I knew, could attract knives as well as nails. I figured that was enough drama for one day, but the bell rang again before noon. This time it was Inspector Kramer, cigar clamped between his teeth, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Don't worry," he grunted when I showed him in. "I'm not here on a murder yet." "Your optimism is misplaced," Wolfe said. Kramer dropped into a chair. "I'll make it quick. I hear this chef's challenge is shaping up to be a mess. Sabotage, fraud, God knows what else. My men don't want to be called in when some hotshot cook ends up poisoned or a kitchen goes up in flames. So I'm telling you now, if you get involved, keep it clean. Don't let it spill over into something I have to mop up." I couldn't resist. "So you're deputizing Wolfe as honorary sanitation?" Kramer shot me a look that could have charred toast. "I'm saying if this blows up, he's right in the middle. And if he is, so am I. And I'd rather not be." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Inspector, your concern is touching. I assure you, if violence intrudes, I shall not invite it here." "My sanctum is sacrosanct," Kramer snorted. "You said that before, and we still had a body in your orchid rooms once. Just don't let me find myself chasing chefs through your hallways." With that he left, trailing cigar smoke like a banner of disapproval. I closed the door and turned back. "Well, that's it. We've officially hit capacity. Chefs, critics, financiers, and now the police. If a marching band shows up tomorrow, we'll have to move to the garden." But Wolfe wasn't laughing. He was staring at the unopened envelope and the folded paper of names. Finally he spoke. "Archie, bring Saul." That got my attention. Wolfe didn't summon Saul Panzer unless he wanted precision. "You're thinking it's already crossed into criminal territory?" I asked. "Not yet," he said, "but it teeters. Vukovic courts me with arrogance. Armand warns with venom. Corbett tempts with gold, and Kramer threatens with bureaucracy. They orbit me, seeking to pull me in. If there is to be mischief, I will have Saul's eyes on it." I nodded. That was the closest Wolfe came to admitting he was hooked. I called Saul, and by evening he was in the office, listening without interrupting as I laid out the parade of visitors. When I finished, Saul rubbed his chin. "Sounds like you've got 4 chefs, each with motive to stab the others in the back. A critic who wants to watch them burn. A financier who needs a win to cash in. And a cop praying it doesn't end in headlines. What do you want me to do?" "To observe," Wolfe said, quietly. "Begin with Vukovic. Chart his movements, his contacts, his indulgences. The man who enters here to provoke me is a man concealing much." Saul nodded once. "Done." He left without another word. I admired that about Saul. Give him a task and he'd move through the city like smoke, unseen but everywhere. As evening settled, I joined Wolfe for dinner. He was silent through most of it, tasting Fritz's veal with uncharacteristic inattention. Finally, he set down his fork. "Archie," he said, "the next stage will not be in kitchens or papers. It will be here. Someone will intrude again, and soon. Be vigilant." He was right, though neither of us knew how soon. At 9:30 the phone rang. I answered, and a voice hissed through the line, low and urgent. "Tell Wolfe, tell him the game has already started. The first move is made." Before I could ask who it was, the line went dead. I returned to the office. Wolfe had seen my face and knew enough not to ask. He simply reached for the envelope at last, slid a finger under the flap and drew out the contents. Cash, crisp and thick. But folded inside was something else, a small square of paper, grease-stained, bearing a single word scrawled in ink. Betrayal. Wolfe stared at it a long moment, then laid it flat on the desk. So, the seasoning has begun, and with that the brownstone was no longer merely disturbed. It had been trespassed. The slip of paper with its greasy smear sat on Wolfe's desk all night like a stain nobody could wash away. He didn't touch it again after laying it flat, but I caught him glancing at it more than once between sips of beer. For Wolfe, that counted as agitation. When he retired to the orchids, I pocketed it. Not because I expected to discover anything miraculous from a sniff or a rub, but because I didn't like the idea of whoever slipped it into the envelope having the satisfaction of imagining Wolfe brooding over it. By morning, the city had the grey haze of a week-old ashtray, and I was out before breakfast to pick up some threads. Saul had already called with a quick update. He'd trailed Vukovic to a late-night meeting at a midtown bar with a man he didn't recognize, tall, sandy-haired, too well-dressed for the company he kept. Nothing obvious exchanged hands, but Saul's instinct said business. He was digging further. That was all I needed to know, that the game had indeed started, and Wolfe was right to brace for more. When I returned to the brownstone, Fritz had prepared kidneys with mushrooms, which Wolfe greeted with a grunt of appreciation. We were halfway through when the doorbell rang again. Wolfe didn't even glance up. Go. The visitor this time was Madeleine Duval. She looked different from the serene hostess I'd met in her curtained restaurant. Tighter, paler, her elegance cracked around the edges. She clutched a handbag like it might sprout teeth and bite her if she let go. Inside the office, she declined a chair until Wolfe insisted. "Monsieur," she began, her voice strained, "something has been taken from me." I eased into my usual seat and waited. Wolfe didn't encourage her, just looked at her with that flat stare of his that pulls more out of people than 1,000 questions. Finally, she opened her bag, drew out a notebook, and set it on the desk. Or what was left of a notebook. Half the pages had been ripped clean out. "My recipes," she said. "Private, personal, never shown to anyone. Last night, when I returned from the market, I found it disturbed. The most important dishes, my signature's gone." "Gone where?" Wolfe asked. "If I knew, would I be here?" She snapped, then immediately pressed her lips tight. "Forgive me. I am desperate. Those dishes, they are my soul. Without them, what am I?" "An ordinary cook," Wolfe said. She flinched as though slapped. I winced, but Wolfe wasn't being cruel. He was being precise, and his precision has a way of cutting deep. Duval leaned forward. "I tell you, monsieur, this is sabotage. Someone means to ruin me before the challenge even begins. They will claim my dishes as their own, or worse, expose them as trite. Either way, I am undone. You must help me. You must." Wolfe tapped the desk once with a finger. "I must do nothing. But your lament is instructive. Archie, when you visited her, did you observe any sign of intrusion?" I shook my head. The place was as neat as a chapel. Either she's a good actress, or she keeps her panic well hidden until it boils over. Duval gripped the edge of the desk. "You do not believe me." "I believe," Wolfe said slowly, "that you have been tampered with, but whether the tampering is theft or manipulation remains to be seen." "Leave the notebook." Her eyes widened. "But leave it," Wolfe repeated. "I wish to see the scrawls of your hand, the smudges of your ink. They will speak more honestly than your pleas." Reluctantly she obeyed, setting the gutted book on the desk and rising with the grace of a queen in defeat. As Fritz escorted her out, I leaned forward. Well, someone sneaks into her place, rips out her best secrets, and walks away whistling. That sounds like more than tampering to me. Wolfe picked up the notebook delicately, as if it might bruise. Perhaps. Or perhaps she removed them herself to bait me. She is French. The French have flair for melodrama. "Careful," I said. "That flair may end up on our carpet before long." Before Wolfe could answer, the phone rang. I grabbed it. Saul's voice, low and clipped, filled the line. "Archie, I've got something." "That man with Vukovic? I tailed him this morning." "Name's Harrington." "Charles Harrington," I blinked. "The society darling himself?" "Unless he's got a twin," Saul said. "They met again today." Harrington passed him a folder. Vukovic tucked it under his coat. Couldn't get close enough to see what was inside. I whistled. So Harrington's playing both ends of the stove. Publicly crowing about his coronation, privately sneaking files to the enemy. Nice. "Keep Wolfe posted," Saul said. "I'll keep digging." I hung up and relayed it. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. So Harrington feigns disdain for Vukovich, yet conspires with him. Duplicitous. That makes at least 3 of them leaning on him. Duval crying theft. De Luca shouting fraud, and now Harrington sneaking folders. Klein's the only one who just looks terrified. Fear, Wolfe murmured, is sometimes the most dangerous motive of all. We didn't get time to chew that over. At 4 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang again. This time it was Anton De Luca, apron still flecked with sauce, his fists knotted as though he meant to batter dough, or me. He pushed past without waiting for permission, bellowing, "Enough! This Vukovich thinks he can play me for a fool? Though I will expose him before all." Wolfe didn't flinch. "Sit and lower your voice." De Luca sat vibrating like a boiler. "Someone has been in my kitchen. My knives, my spices, touched, moved. I know it, I feel it. He means to sabotage me. I come here, Wolfe, to demand you stop this madness. If you judge, you must see it." "You must!" I tried soothing him, but he was too wound up. Wolfe let him rant until he sputtered out of words. Then Wolfe asked softly, "What was touched?" "My jar of saffron," De Luca said instantly. "It was not where I left it. And saffron is gold. If it is gone, if it is misused, my reputation collapses." "Saffron," Wolfe repeated, and closed his eyes. That was enough for De Luca to storm back out, swearing vengeance on anyone with a stove. I shut the door after him and shook my head. First a missing recipe, now a jar of saffron. Somebody's playing scavenger hunt with the chefs. Question is why? "Because," Wolfe said, "they know that the surest way to unnerve an artist is not to strike him, but to move his tools. Small trespasses, subtle, effective." He leaned back and his eyes settled on the word still scrawled on that grease-stained scrap. "Betrayal." "Archie," he said, "the seasoning intensifies. We are no longer courted. We are involved. Prepare for the gathering storm." And as if to prove him right, the phone rang again. I picked up, and a voice I recognized this time, David Klein's, whispered urgently. "They're coming for me next," he said. "Please, Mr. Goodwin, tell Wolfe before it's too late." Then the line went dead. I set the receiver down slowly. Wolfe hadn't moved. He didn't need to. His mind was already halfway across the city, stirring the pot. The brownstone wasn't just disturbed anymore. It was becoming the kitchen where everyone's schemes were simmering, and sooner or later the lid would blow. Klein's voice still echoed in my ear long after the line went dead. I set the receiver down and turned toward Wolfe, who hadn't shifted an inch, though his eyes had narrowed to slits. If you've never seen Wolfe in that state, it's like watching a bear half asleep but ready to maul if poked. He sounded half out of his skin, I said. If he's not exaggerating, somebody's moving quick. Recipes missing, saffron jar misplaced. Now a young chef crying into the phone like the wolves are at his door. Looks like sabotage season has officially opened. "Not sabotage," Wolfe said, his voice a low rumble. "Or not merely. A design." I took my chair, stretched out, and tapped my notebook with the pencil. "Design or not, Klein isn't the type to invent boogeymen. He's green, sure, but scared straight. Should I go check on him?" Wolfe closed his eyes. "No, if harm has come, it is done. If not, he will stew until forced to act. Better that than your gallivanting to reassure him. He will come or not. Let him. That was Wolfe for you. Let the pieces move until they reached his square." I wasn't about to argue, but I filed it away. Klein might be fragile enough to snap, and when fragile people snap, someone else often bleeds. Fritz brought coffee, and the rest of the day dragged in that tense quiet that settles before a storm. Saul phoned twice, both times with slim reports. Vukovich had met another man, identity unknown, near Union Square. Harrington had been sighted later at a printing shop. Nothing earth-shaking, but the kind of crumbs Saul was good at turning into trails. It was after dinner, while Wolfe was draining his second beer, that the next trespass arrived. I had just settled with the evening paper when I noticed a faint scent drifting through the office. Not Fritz's handiwork, not cigar smoke, but sharper, metallic, with a hint of citrus. I looked around and spotted it. A small envelope slipped under the front door, barely visible on the carpet. I picked it up, carried it in, and handed it over. Wolfe opened it carefully with a paper knife. Inside was a card, plain white with 2 words scrawled in the same rushed hand as the first note. Spice stolen. I muttered something impolite. Wolfe read it twice, then placed it next to the grease-stained slip. 2 notes, 2 warnings, all taunts. You think this ties to DeLuca's missing saffron? I asked. Obviously, Wolfe said, but it was not DeLuca who sent it. He is too blunt, too proud. He bellows, he does not whisper. Someone else wishes us to see that the thefts are part of a pattern. Somebody's sending us grocery lists, I said. Recipes gone, saffron gone, spices missing. If they keep this up, Fritz will bolt the pantry. Wolfe ignored me, staring at the cards as if they were chess pieces. Archie, call Saul, tell him to watch Duval and DeLuca tonight. If either moves oddly, I want to know. I made the call, Saul answering with his usual brisk calm. He took the assignment without comment. That was why Wolfe trusted him more than almost anyone. No questions, just quiet execution. Around 10 o'clock, just as I was thinking the evening might limp to a close, the bell rang again. This time the visitor was Celeste Armand, the critic, her eyes sharper than before. She didn't wait for invitation, just swept inside like she owned the parquet. Mr. Wolfe, she said, you must listen. I have proof. Vukovic is orchestrating this. She handed over a folded sheet torn from a restaurant ledger. It showed deliveries, itemized, saffron, peppercorns, cinnamon, all ordered in unusual quantities, signed not by DeLuca or Duval but by proxies, through a middleman address. I obtained this from a contact at the supplier, she said, lowering her voice. It indicates theft, fraud, someone acquiring rare spices under false names. Do you see? He means to frame them each in turn and then triumph over the chaos. I read it over. Looks convincing enough, but convenient too. How did you get this? She smiled thinly. A critic has ears everywhere. Do not question the source, Mr. Goodwin. Question the purpose. Wolfe regarded her with the disdain of a man forced to sample bad wine. Madam, your zeal is admirable. But if you imagine I will leap like a trout at every scrap dangled before me, you misjudge me. I require more than a ledger fragment. Celeste's jaw tightened. Then you will have it soon. But be warned, if you hesitate, the challenge will collapse into scandal and you with it. She swept out, leaving the ledger page behind like a poisoned gift. I looked at Wolfe. She's either our best ally or the best liar in the room. And with this crowd, that's a high bar. Wolfe gave the faintest nod. She is neither. She is an opportunist. But opportunists sometimes stumble on truths. The room fell quiet. The 2 notes on the desk, the gutted recipe book, the rumor of stolen saffron and now the ledger scrap, all forming a stew that smelled more rancid than refined. Wolfe leaned back, fingers pressing together, eyes closing. Archie, he said finally, tomorrow summon them here. Not all but 2, Duval and DeLuca. Let them squabble in my presence. I wish to observe. You sure you want their fireworks in here? The carpet might not survive. It will survive, but their egos may not. And that will be useful. I didn't argue. By now I'd learned that when Wolfe decided to let the storm into the brownstone, it was because he already had an umbrella. That night, as I was shutting down for bed, the phone rang again. I picked up, half expecting Klein's quaver. Instead, a new voice rasped, low, male, accented. Tell Wolfe, it said, that the next ingredient will not be stolen. It will be blood. The line went dead before I could answer. I stood there, phone in hand, listening to the hum of the empty line. Then I set it down, walked to Wolfe's door and knocked once. When I entered, he was still in his chair, eyes closed as though he'd been waiting. Well? He asked, I told him. His eyes opened then, dark and hard. So, the seasoning is complete. Now they mean to cook with fire. I didn't say it aloud, but I knew what he meant. The trespasses were no longer small. The brownstone had been marked as the arena. And from now on the danger wouldn't be confined to recipes and spices. The threat had settled into the brownstone like a bad odor, invisible but everywhere. Wolfe didn't say another word that night, only motioned for me to leave him in peace, which I did after triple-checking the locks and making sure Fritz hadn't absent-mindedly left the kitchen window cracked. By morning, the house had the brittle hush of a church where someone had whispered fire. Fritz served us eggs and sausages, but neither of us gave the plate its due. Wolfe pushed his food around, a sure sign that his brain was too engaged to bother with his stomach, which was like watching the Hudson forget to flow. "You still want Duval and DeLuca brought in?" I asked. "Bring them," he said flatly. "Together. At noon." That was all the instruction I got, so I set about arranging it. Duval was easy. Her voice trembled on the line, and she agreed at once. DeLuca barked that he had no time for Wolfe's games, then agreed anyway, perhaps because he wanted a stage for his temper. By 11, the table was set for a collision. They arrived within minutes of each other, and it was a small miracle the foyer survived. Duval swept in with indignation disguised as poise. DeLuca stormed in red-faced and roaring about thieves. I herded them into the office before Fritz threw them both out for ruining his carpets. Wolfe sat like a mountain, motionless, letting them flare at each other. Duval accused DeLuca of orchestrating the theft of her recipes. DeLuca accused her of framing him with the saffron story. Their voices tangled until I wanted to bang their heads together like cymbals. Finally, Wolfe spoke, cutting through the noise like a cleaver. "Enough, sit." They obeyed, still seething, and Wolfe turned his gaze from one to the other. "You each believe the other guilty of a trespass. Both may be correct, or both may be pawns. Either way, you insult yourselves by squawking like gulls. I asked you here to observe. Observe what?" DeLuca demanded. "Observe how swiftly suspicion clouds judgment," Wolfe said. "Someone manipulates you. You oblige them?" Duval pressed a hand to her chest. "You think this is staged?" "I think," Wolfe replied, "that a thief clever enough to trespass kitchens and ledgers is clever enough to stir tempers. And tempers once stirred spoil more than broth." That quieted them for a beat, though not for long. Duval insisted her notebook was sacred, irreplaceable. DeLuca swore someone had touched his saffron. Wolfe listened without blinking. Then he rang for Fritz, who entered carrying a small tray. On it were 3 tiny glass jars, each filled with different spices. "Mr. Goodwin," Wolfe said, "open them." I did, and the scents filled the room. "Saffron, cardamom, cloves, note," Wolfe said, "that they are authentic. I had Fritz fetch them from his pantry. Now observe." He gestured to Duval's notebook still on his desk. He opened a page and tapped a faint yellow stain at the margin. "Saffron, the hand that removed your recipes smudged fingers first. So the theft of your pages and the disturbance of DeLuca's saffron are not separate. They are linked," Duval gasped. DeLuca glared. I jotted the connection down. Wolfe closed the notebook and set it aside as if the matter were temporarily filed. "You will both return to your kitchens," he told them, "and await summons. For now you are dismissed." They didn't like it, but Wolfe had a way of making dismissal sound like divine decree. I ushered them out, both muttering under their breath, and returned to find Wolfe studying the spice jars as though they held confessions. "You've tied them together," I said. "But tied to what?" "To Vukovich." "To Harrington's secret folder." "To Klein's panic attack?" "Patience, Archie," Wolfe said. "The stew simmers. Not yet ready." Patience isn't my middle name, but I let it ride. At 2 o'clock, Saul called again, his voice clipped. "Archie, I've got something." Harrington met Vukovich again. Same spot, same exchange. This time I got a glimpse inside the folder. Recipes. Handwritten. Looked like Duval's style if my memory of French scrawl serves. "That's her missing pages," I said. "Could be," Saul said. Vukovich was grinning like a fox with feathers on his lips. I thanked him, hung up and passed it on to Wolfe. His eyes gleamed, not triumph, but confirmation. "So Harrington delivers the stolen goods," he murmured. "Predictable. He masks ambition as charm. But ambition always leaks. He conspires with Vukovich to discredit Duval. Convenient, but too convenient. Too convenient how? Because, Wolfe said, the saffron links DeLuca as well. Two birds with one smudge. Harrington cannot be both thief and saboteur alone. Someone else orchestrates. That someone was the question. I was about to ask if Wolfe had theories when the bell rang yet again. This time it was Klein. He looked worse than before, pale and clammy, his hands shaking as he clutched a folded napkin. I got him into the office, where he stood like a defendant awaiting sentencing. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "they've marked me now. Last night someone broke into my bistro. They left this." He handed over the napkin. Wolfe unfolded it carefully. Inside, written in the same jagged hand as the other notes, was a single phrase: "Your blood for their spice." Klein nearly collapsed into a chair. "They want me destroyed. I don't belong in this. I never should have agreed." "Sit still," Wolfe commanded. His voice anchored the boy like a weight. "Panic is the ally of your enemy. Speak. Was anything taken?" Klein shook his head. "No, just the note. But it was left on my stove." That detail sat heavy in the room. A note promising blood, left where flames belonged. Wolfe folded the napkin, set it atop the other notes, and leaned back. "So we have escalation. From recipes to saffron to threats of death. We have theft, collusion, and manipulation. And all roads circle Vukovich, yet he remains untouched. Archie, yeah? Summon them all. Tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock here." "All? You mean Duval, DeLuca, Harrington, Klein, and Vukovich," Wolfe said. "And the critic Armand. Even the financier Corbett. Let them all sit before me. The trespasses have reached their crescendo. It is time they are confronted." I whistled. "That's going to be one crowded office. You sure Fritz won't bolt?" "Fritz will endure," Wolfe said. "The brownstone will contain them, but only if we hold them within our walls. Out there the game is chaos. In here it will be order." "My order?" The certainty in his tone tightened something in my gut. Wolfe was ready to pull the net. But when you haul in a net heavy with fish, you sometimes catch sharks. I escorted Klein out, promised him we'd call, and returned to find Wolfe still staring at the growing pile of notes. His lips pressed into a line. "The first trespass was theft," he said. "The second, sabotage. The third, a threat. Now comes the fourth, revelation. And revelation, Archie, is always the most dangerous." I didn't argue. Outside, the city rattled on, but inside, the brownstone felt like a sealed pot, pressure building. Tomorrow night, Wolfe would lift the lid, and God help whoever had seasoned the stew with blood. The day of Wolfe's grand summons began with the kind of silence that feels like a drum beat under the floorboards. Fritz moved about quietly, but even his careful footfalls seemed heavy, like he knew the house was bracing for impact. Wolfe didn't stir from his chair except to sip beer. I kept the phone close in case Saul called with another update, but until evening it was all waiting, and waiting in the brownstone feels a lot like sitting inside a coiled spring. At 6, Fritz started preparing a light supper for Wolfe, lighter than usual, though light in Wolfe's book still meant enough for 3 ordinary men. By 7 I'd polished the office, straightened the chairs, and cleared every surface except Wolfe's desk, where the stack of notes and scraps sat like the central exhibit of a trial. Wolfe hadn't touched them all day, but I knew he was letting them season in his mind, blending into a recipe only he could taste. At 8 sharp, the bell rang. First in was Vukovich himself, sleek and confident, his smile broad enough to suggest he thought this was his stage. Behind him came Duval, pale but composed, clutching her gloves like lifelines. DeLuca stormed in next, muttering in Italian, his face dark with suspicion. Harrington followed, as smooth as an ad campaign, nodding like a prince bestowing blessings. Klein trailed behind, nervous, twitching, glancing at the corners of the room as if assassins lurked in the curtains. Celeste Armand arrived last, her eyes glittering, and Corbett the financier appeared just as I was closing the door, smelling of cigar smoke and self-importance. I guided them into the office, where Wolfe sat waiting like a king holding court. His presence alone quieted the room, though the air hummed with tension. I took my usual chair, notebook ready, but this wasn't one of Wolfe's idle games. This was the gathering he'd been steering toward, and everyone knew it. "Ladies, gentlemen," Wolfe said, his voice measured, "you have trespassed into my sanctuary. Ordinarily I would resent this. Tonight I welcome it. You will listen, and you will speak only when addressed." "Archie, lock the door." I did, and the click sounded final enough to make Klein flinch. Wolfe leaned back, folding his hands over his middle. "You have all felt the touch of sabotage. Recipes vanished, spices misplaced, notes delivered. You have all suspected one another. That was the design, to divide you, to scatter your suspicions like seeds. But the hand that sowed them is one, not many." A ripple moved through the group. DeLuca barked, "It was her," pointing at Duval. She shot back, furious. "Nonsense! It was you." Harrington smirked, clearly enjoying the chaos. "Silence," Wolfe commanded, and they fell still. His voice thickened, deliberate. "Madame Duval, your notebook was raided. The smudge of saffron on its margin linked your loss to Mr. DeLuca's trespass. Mr. DeLuca, your jar was not stolen but shifted to unnerve you. Both acts came from one mind, not yours. Mr. Harrington, you were seen delivering a folder of recipes to Vukovich, and Mr. Vukovich, you accepted it. You would have us believe this was a harmless exchange. Fie, you collude." Vukovich's smile faltered. "You presume much, Wolfe. Business between gentlemen." "Gentlemen?" Wolfe cut him off, his eyes snapping open. "You presume to call yourself that while peddling theft? You sought to destroy Madame Duval, and you enlisted Mr. Harrington to fetch what you dared not steal yourself. That folder was bait, intended to implicate him if exposed, while preserving your hands as clean. But your arrogance betrayed you. You could not resist flaunting it." Duval gasped. Harrington flushed, then tried to laugh it off, but Wolfe's gaze pinned him like a butterfly. "And you, Mr. Klein," Wolfe went on, softer now. Klein sat straighter, trembling. "You were chosen as the victim, the lamb. Notes left for you. Threats scrawled on your stove. You were meant to crumble first, to distract the others. And you nearly did." Klein swallowed hard, whispering, I thought they would kill me." "They might have," Wolfe said, "but not yet. You were kept alive to draw out sympathy, to add seasoning to their stew of suspicion. You are young, vulnerable. That made you ideal. But the true danger, the true orchestrator, hides still." The room crackled. All eyes darted from one to the next. Celeste Armand leaned forward. "Then who? Who is it?" Wolfe's gaze shifted to her, steady, cold. "Madam Critic, you brought scraps, ledger pages, whispered warnings. Too timely, too convenient. You present yourself as messenger, but in truth you stir the pot. You knew of the thefts before they were spoken aloud. You knew of the deliveries. Why? Because you orchestrated them." The silence that followed was thick enough to chew. Celeste's face went rigid, her painted lips parting. "You dare! I do not dare." "I state," Wolfe said. "You despise Vukovich, yet you require him. His arrogance makes him the perfect villain in your narrative. You pit him against rivals, tarnish them with theft, inflame their egos, then arrive with proof only you could produce. If the challenge collapses, you emerge triumphant, your pen sharpened, your influence supreme. If it continues, it does so under the shadow you cast. Either way, you win." Corbett exhaled sharply. "This is madness. She's a critic, not a thief." Wolfe turned his gaze on him. "And you, Mr. Corbett, are a financier, not a cook. Yet you meddle in kitchens for profit. Do not feign surprise that a critic meddles for power." Celeste rose, trembling with rage. "This is slander." "You have no proof." Wolfe's eyes glittered. "On the contrary, proof lies in your timing. You brought the ledger page before Saul could uncover it. You named the thefts before they were reported. You are the only one who gains regardless of outcome. And you left the notes. The handwriting matches your flourish style. Archie, I was ready. I pulled from my pocket the scraps I'd tucked away, comparing them with a signature from one of her published reviews I'd clipped earlier in the week. The loops and slants were a match. Celeste's composure cracked. She snatched at the papers, but I held them out of reach. Her face contorted. Then she let out a low, bitter laugh. So what if I did? They deserved it, all of them. Vukovic with his tyranny, Duval with her pretensions, De Luca with his rages, Harrington with his vanity. They are frauds, all of them. I only hastened their exposure. Duval shouted. De Luca cursed. Harrington tried to smooth things over, but Wolfe silenced them with a raised hand. Enough. Madam, you call it exposure. I call it sabotage. You trespassed in kitchens, you incited theft, you sowed fear. You are guilty not of murder, but of moral violence. And you will be known for it. Celeste's bravado slipped into desperation. You can't prove it to the world. You'll have no witness. You are your own witness, Wolfe said. Your confession stands here, before rivals and financier alike. Should I wish, I can deliver it to Inspector Kramer. But I will not. The law has no appetite for pettiness dressed as crime. Instead, your reputation will rot. Word of this will spread, whispered by those present. That is your punishment. Not death, obscurity. She sagged into her chair, eyes hollow. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes. The matter is concluded. The challenge may proceed or collapse as it will. You may all leave my house. The room erupted, voices overlapping, accusations hurled, defenses muttered. I unlocked the door, and one by one they spilled into the night, each carrying the weight of what had been revealed. When the last had gone, I closed the door and turned back. Wolfe sat still as if carved in stone, the notes and scraps gathered neatly before him. Finally he spoke. Archie, humanity has endless appetite for food, for fame, for ruin. Tonight we witnessed its banquet. I jotted the line, knowing it was his final word on the matter. The brownstone at last grew quiet again. The brownstone had settled back into silence, but it wasn't the kind of silence you trusted. It was brittle, stretched tight like a drum skin that could split with one sharp strike. Wolfe hadn't moved since the last of them left, and I wasn't fool enough to interrupt his brooding. He sat with his eyes closed, hands folded, the scraps of notes stacked neatly before him as though they were flowers on an altar. Fritz padded about the kitchen with unusual heaviness, and even the orchids upstairs seemed to droop with the weight of the evening. I took my refuge in routine, cleared glasses, straightened chairs, jotted notes on the storm we'd just endured. When I finally sat, Wolfe opened his eyes, and I knew he'd been waiting for me to finish the chores before speaking. Archie, he said, his tone slow, deliberate. What remains unclear? Plenty, I told him. You flayed Armand like a trout, and she confessed enough to stink up her career. But she's not the whole dish. Harrington still passed her stolen recipes. Vukovic still played the fox. De Luca still swore murder over saffron. Duval still wailed about her pages, and Klein still ready to jump out of his shoes. They don't walk out of here innocent just because Armand was loudest. He inclined his head. The faintest acknowledgement. Correct. Armand's confession resolves the orchestration, but not the method. Not yet. Each had a role, whether witting or not. The thefts, the trespasses, the threats, they were her design but not executed by her alone. She had assistance, an accomplice, or pawns, Wolfe said. Which is worse? Pawns are cheaper, disposable. That didn't sit well with me because pawns bleed like anyone else. I thought of Klein's pale face, the napkin with its promise of blood, and didn't like where it led. Before I could say it, the phone rang. I grabbed it, half expecting Saul's calm drawl. Instead, it was trembling, ragged. Klein again. Mr. Goodwin, please, you must come. There's been... His words broke apart, strangled by static and panic. Then the line went dead. I slammed the receiver down. That was Klein. He sounded bad. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. Where? He didn't say. Find out, Wolfe ordered, his voice suddenly iron. Now. I called Saul, and Luck was with me. He was already tailing Klein's place, said lights had flared inside, then gone dark. No one had left yet. I told him to stay put. I was on my way. I grabbed my coat and hat. Wolfe didn't try to stop me, which told me plenty about his concern. He may not leave the brownstone for love or money, but when he sends me running without argument, it means the stakes have boiled over. By the time I reached Klein's bistro, the street was slick with evening drizzle. Sol was across the way, leaning casual against a lamppost, but his eyes were sharp. He jerked his chin toward the door. Something's wrong. He went inside an hour ago. Then the lights went crazy. Nobody's come out. We crossed together. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the air was thick, pungent, spiced but spoiled. Chairs knocked over. A pot overturned, the stove cold but smeared with ash. And on the floor, Klein, crumpled, breathing shallow but alive. A cut on his forehead, nothing fatal but ugly enough to make my stomach twist. "Ambulance?" I asked. Saul shook his head. "Look." Pinned to Klein's chest with a kitchen skewer was another note, the same jagged hand. "The lamb bleeds first." I pulled it free carefully, then bent down to Klein. He stirred, groaned, muttered something I couldn't catch. Saul fetched water and we got him upright enough to croak. He whispered. "They wanted me to run, to leave. Said if I stayed, I'd die." "Who said?" I pressed, his eyes fluttered. "Couldn't see, masked, but—" "The smell cigars, expensive, Corbett. The financier." The thought snapped into place with the neatness of a knife sliding into a sheath. We left Klein under Saul's watch, stable but shaken, and I hurried back to the brownstone. Wolfe was waiting, eyes already open as though he'd seen it all in his mind. I laid the note on the desk. He read it once, twice, then exhaled slowly. "So escalation, predictable." "Predictable," I snapped. Klein nearly had his skull split open. "That's not predictable, that's attempted murder." "Not murder," Wolfe said calmly. "The note insists he lived to bleed but not die. Symbolic. They seek to terrorize, not eliminate. At least not yet," I paced. "And the cigar?" He said the attacker stank of them. "That points to Corbett." "Perhaps," Wolfe murmured. "Or perhaps he was meant to believe so." "Recall, Archie. Deception thrives in association. Corbett smokes, therefore suspicion is guided. Too obvious. Then who?" "Not yet," Wolfe said. "Not until they are pressed again. Tomorrow Klein must be brought here, safe." And the others summoned once more. I threw up my hands. "We just had them here. You want round two?" "Yes," Wolfe said, "because the trespasses continue. First theft, then tampering, then threats, now assault. The pattern grows, and the crescendo is near." That was Wolfe's word for it, crescendo. To me it felt like a train barreling toward us without brakes. I poured myself a stiff drink and tried to calm the buzzing in my head. Wolfe sat immovable, his gaze on the scraps before him. Finally he spoke, soft but heavy. "Archie, humanity plays at appetite, but appetite devours. Tonight someone tasted blood. Tomorrow they will hunger for more. We must serve them before they feast." I didn't argue. Outside the drizzle turned to steady rain, tapping the windows like impatient fingers. Inside the brownstone waited, tense, knowing the storm had only just begun. The rain hammered through the night and left the city slick and shining by morning, like someone had tried to wash away its sins and quit halfway. Fritz brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead, which was appropriate since Klein had come close enough to the part. He was still alive, though, and Saul reported he was tucked away in a private room at a clinic where nobody would find him unless they had the map and compass of Providence. Wolfe had ordered it, his way of keeping the lamb from further bleeding. By 10, Wolfe had me at the phone again, summoning the same crew back to the brownstone. He didn't explain. He rarely does. I thought about telling him they'd riot before setting foot inside again, but I swallowed it. They all came the first time. They'd come again. Pride, fear, greed. Those were stronger than sense. At 7 that evening the bell rang and the parade began. Vukovic, slick as ever, pretending indifference. Duval still trembling but stubborn. Toluca with his volcanic scowl. Harrington grinning like scandal was perfume. Corbett exhaling cigars and arrogance. And Celeste Armand, her poise cracked but intact, determined to reclaim control. Klein, of course, was absent. Wolfe wasn't about to risk him again. They filed into the office with the resignation of gamblers, called back to the table for one last hand. Wolfe sat behind his desk, a king on his throne, the scraps and notes neatly stacked in front of him like playing cards. I locked the door again because Wolfe had said so, and because I wasn't keen on anyone bolting before the truth boiled over. "You return," Wolfe said, his voice even, not by my request but by necessity. "Last night Mr. Klein was assaulted. He lives, but the threat escalates. The trespass is now violence, and violence cannot be ignored. That landed like a knife." Duval gasped. DeLuca swore. Harrington raised his brows theatrically. Corbett frowned as though someone had dented his stocks. Armand sat very straight, her eyes on Wolfe. "You accuse us?" Vukovich said, voice smooth but sharp at the edges. "I accuse the design," Wolfe answered. "And I will expose its hand. First, let us recall theft of recipes, tampering with spices, threats delivered, and assault staged. Each act aimed to fracture, to turn you upon one another while one benefited. You presumed it was Vukovich or Harrington or DeLuca, but you were wrong." Harrington laughed lightly. "Then by all means enlighten us. I'm dying to know who's writing these melodramas." "You will die of nothing so dignified," Wolfe said dryly. Then his eyes shifted, dark and steady. "The architect is you, Mr. Corbett," the room erupted. Corbett shot to his feet, face flushing crimson. "Absurd, I am an investor, not a thief. You insult me." "You reek of cigars," Wolfe said. Klein smelled them when he was attacked. A clue too convenient unless intended. But you miscalculated. You assumed terror would silence him. Instead he spoke. And you could not resist the indulgence of your own scent, could not cloak your vanity. Armand provided the orchestration, but you provided the hand. She wrote the notes. You placed them. She whispered sabotage. You enacted it. Together you sought to ruin them, to control the outcome of the challenge. If it collapsed, you salvaged investments. If Vukovich triumphed, your stake doubled. If others fell, you profited. In every path you fed, Corbett's fists clenched. Lies, no, Wolfe said softly. Truth, Archie, I was ready. From my pocket I produced the ledger stub Saul had dug up, showing spice orders placed through a proxy. Corbett's signature on the payment authorization matched exactly the flourish on his business accounts I'd filched from public records. Wolfe hadn't seen it until now, but he'd known I'd have it ready. Corbett froze when I held the papers up. His lips parted, then shut. Wolfe's tone hardened. You masked your gluttony in investments, Mr. Corbett. But greed, like garlic, cannot be concealed. You paid for the saffron, for the spices, for the stage. Armand sharpened the knives, but you wielded them. Together you sought to bleed reputations and gorge on the ruins. Armand sprang up, her mask shattering. You dare to bind me to him. I exposed their frauds. I revealed truth. You revealed nothing, Wolfe thundered. His voice rolled through the room like a drum. You hid behind criticism and schemes, too timid to strike alone. You required a financier to soil his hands, to fetch what you lacked the nerve to touch. Without him you are wind. Without you he is merely a glutton. Together you brewed poison. For a moment silence. Then DeLuca bellowed. Duval cried. Harrington muttered oaths. Vukovich leaned back, finally stripped of his smugness. Corbett slumped into his chair, the fight leaking out of him. And what then, Wolfe? You drag us to Kramer. You think the police care for saffron jars and recipes? They will laugh. Wolfe's eyes closed briefly, then opened. The law is blunt. This crime is subtle. No blood was meant to spill, only fear. But attempted assault is not subtle, and you will answer for it. I will not call Kramer. I will allow him to come, as he always does, sniffing scandal. And when he does, you will not be shielded by your ledgers. Corbett swallowed, his hands twitching. Armand tried to rise again, but the others crowded her, disgust thick in their faces. She had lost her audience. Wolfe's voice lowered, almost contemplative. You are guilty, not of murder, but of the sin worse than murder, the deliberate corrosion of trust. You trespassed against integrity for appetite. That is your condemnation." He gestured once and I unlocked the door. One by one they filed out, silence heavier than shouting. Corbett and Armand last, their shoulders bent, their power dissolved. When the door shut, the brownstone breathed again. Wolfe leaned back, exhaled, and let his eyes close. "Archie," he said, "fetch me beer. This house has been fouled enough by arrogance. Let us cleanse it." I did, and for a moment we sat in peace. Fritz's dinner waited, warm and fragrant, unspoiled by sabotage. Outside, the city steamed under the rain. Inside, the brownstone was whole again, its sanctity restored by words sharper than knives. Wolfe lifted his glass, and though he said nothing more, the look in his eyes was enough. He had judged, condemned, and concluded. The case was not murder, but it had cut deep enough, and like always, he'd stitched it closed without leaving his chair. The brownstone had returned to its sacred quiet, but it wasn't the easy kind that comes after a routine case is wrapped and filed away. This quiet was layered, heavy, like dust settling after an explosion. Wolfe had taken his beer and finished it with unusual haste, which meant he was still simmering. Fritz cleared the remnants of dinner with the gentleness of a man walking among shards of glass. I sat across from Wolfe, notebook closed, pencil idle, waiting for him to speak first. He didn't, not for a long while. The clock ticked, the radiator hissed, and the storm outside thinned to a mist. Finally, Wolfe opened his eyes. "Archie, what remains uncertain?" I spread my hands. "Plenty. Sure, you unmasked Armand and Corbett, but I can't shake the feeling that they weren't the whole orchestra. They set the score, sure, but somebody else was playing instruments out of tune. Vukovic still grins like he owns the city. Harrington still ducks and dodges. DeLuca still bellows, Duval still trembles, and Klein, if he doesn't faint first, still looks like he knows more than he says." "That doesn't add up to neat closure." Wolfe tilted his head, as if weighing my words the way he might weigh a new seasoning in a familiar dish. "Closure is not neat, Archie. It is inevitable. The perpetrators have been exposed, their reputations shredded. That suffices, maybe for you, but I don't like the smell of it. Corbett may have been caught with his fingers in the spice jar, but he didn't strike Klein, not directly. How that kind of muscle takes someone else." Wolfe let out a slow sigh. "Violence is often subcontracted, true, but the hand that guides is more culpable than the fist that falls. Klein's blood, such as it was, lies at Corbett's feet. Whether or not he swung the skewer is irrelevant." I leaned forward. "Try telling Klein that. He thought he was about to be butchered. If he finds out the man who scared him half to death gets nothing more than social exile, he won't feel so philosophical." Wolfe's lips tightened. "Archie, must you persist in championing sentiment? Somebody has to. It sure won't be you." He gave me a look sharp enough to slice, but he didn't answer. That was the closest he'd ever come to conceding a point. The night ended there, with Wolfe disappearing into the orchids and me pacing the hall, wondering if the stew of egos outside the brownstone was really finished boiling. Morning brought no peace. Saul called just after breakfast. His voice was low, measured, but there was a current in it I didn't like. "Archie, Corbett's out. He was seen at a downtown club, meeting two men I don't recognize. They were rough, ex-prizefighter types. Money changed hands." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "So he's still moving pieces. He didn't slink away like a good little shamed financier." "No," Saul said. "He's digging in." I thanked him and relayed it to Wolfe. He didn't flinch, didn't even look surprised. He simply pressed his lips together and muttered, "Predictable. Predictable. Wolfe, the man's practically hiring thugs in broad daylight." "That's not predictable, that's escalation." "It is desperation," Wolfe corrected. "He is cornered. Hand-cornered men lash out before they collapse." That sounded neat on paper, but it didn't ease the knot in my gut. Klein had nearly been skewered once. I wasn't eager to see who might bleed next. At 11, Harrington called, his voice dripping with faux camaraderie. "Goodwin, old boy. Perhaps you might tell Wolfe I'd be delighted to host him for luncheon." "No fuss, just friends." I nearly dropped the receiver from laughing. Wolfe, luncheon? You're out of your mind. Try sending him a crate of orchids. He'll ignore those too. Harrington chuckled. Just thought I'd extend the olive branch. So after last night's theatrics, some of us feel bruised. Yeah, I said. Bruised reputations, bruised egos. Nothing compared to bruised skulls. He went quiet for a beat. You can't prove any of it in court, you know. Wolfe's pronouncements carry weight, but not gavel weight. That's the problem with truth, Harrington, I told him. It doesn't always come with paperwork. I hung up before he could wriggle further. By afternoon, I'd had enough of the brownstone's walls. Wolfe forbade me from leaving on most errands until summoned, but this time he gave me a nod. Go, observe, report, but do not meddle, which of course meant meddle carefully. I made the rounds. Duval's restaurant was half empty, whispers chasing her like shadows. DeLuca's kitchen thundered as usual, but I caught him staring at the saffron jar with the intensity of a man guarding his last child. Vukovic was the same as ever, smiling too wide, shaking too many hands, basking in the attention of critics who hadn't yet read the smoke in the air. And Harrington, from the glimpses I got through his glittering dining room, looked more nervous than his polished smile admitted. By the time I returned, the brownstone smelled of lamb shanks Fritz had coaxed into perfection. Wolfe sat in his chair, silent, the notes still before him. He finally spoke after I finished my report. They are unraveling, he said. Duval with fear, DeLuca with fury, Harrington with vanity, Vukovic with arrogance. Each thread phrase. And Corbett, the weaver, pulls too hard. The fabric will tear. And when it tears? I asked. Then, Wolfe said, truth will be laid bare. And it will not be pleasant. The bell rang then, sharp and insistent. Fritz answered, then brought in David Klein, pale but steadier, a bandage on his temple. He looked at Wolfe like a supplicant before an altar. Mr. Wolfe, he said hoarsely, I cannot do it. I cannot face them. I want to withdraw from the challenge. Wolfe regarded him with cool detachment. If you withdraw, you reward them. You give them the triumph they sought. Do you wish to live in their shadow? I want to live, Klein said simply. That's all. Wolfe's eyes closed for a moment. Archie, escort Mr. Klein upstairs. He will dine with Fritz, then he will rest. And tomorrow he will remain here under my roof. That stunned me. Wolfe rarely invited outsiders into his sanctuary. But his tone brooked no argument. I led Klein upstairs, left him with Fritz, and returned to find Wolfe still unmoving. He finally murmured, The lamb must not be slaughtered. If it is, then appetite wins, and I will not allow it. I leaned against the doorframe, studying him. You sound almost protective. Phooey, Wolfe said. I am protective of order. Klein is merely its symbol. Maybe, but I saw the flicker in his eyes, and I knew better. The storm outside had passed, but inside the brownstone, the real storm was only gathering. The house had taken on a strange rhythm with Klein upstairs, as though the brownstone itself was adjusting to an unfamiliar guest. Fritz moved with quiet vigilance, making sure Klein had food and blankets, and I checked on him twice, finding him pale but calmer, like a man who'd found a brief island in a storm. Wolfe, however, remained immovable, as if by planting himself firmly in his chair, he could anchor the whole mess in place. By the next morning, the tension had ripened. Wolfe called me into the office, the stack of notes and scraps still resting on his desk like a shrine. He looked at me, his eyes half-lidded but sharp beneath the heavy folds. Archie, it will end today. I'd heard that tone before. Wolfe didn't say it unless he'd already mapped the conclusion in his head. I poured myself coffee and waited for the rest. They will be summoned again, he said. Not for petty confrontation this time, but for reckoning. The brownstone will not host their rancor twice without closure. Reckoning sounds like you plan to serve them raw, I said. Cooked just enough, he replied. By noon, I was at the phone again. The same names, the same voices, some protesting, some eager, all compelled. They might despise Wolfe, but they couldn't resist his summons. Pride, fear, greed, those were stronger than fatigue. At 8 they gathered again, filling the office with their presence like overripe fruit crammed into a basket. Vukovich still smug, Duval tight as a coiled spring, De Luca huffing like a bull in a pen, Harrington smiling brittle, Corbett puffing his cigars like armor, Armand pale with fury that hadn't cooled. Klein remained upstairs, safe under Fritz's watch. Wolfe looked at them and spoke with the calm weight of inevitability. You return because the matter festers. It will not fester after tonight. You have lied, concealed, colluded. You sought to play games of sabotage and intimidation. But the truth is no longer scattered. It is gathered. Duval leaned forward, desperate. Then speak, monsieur. Who betrayed us? Wolfe's eyes rested on her briefly, then shifted. You were betrayed by more than one. Armand schemed, Corbett funded. But they did not act alone. They required complicity. Mr. Harrington, your role was not minor. You ferried stolen recipes to Vukovich, thinking you masked your ambition. You were the courier, the smiling thief. And, Vukovich, you accepted them eagerly, your arrogance blinding you to the snare. Vukovich straightened, voice smooth but thin. That's absurd. I never— You did, Wolfe cut him off. Saul Panzer saw you twice. The folder passed from Harrington to your hands, and inside were pages from Duval's notebook, smudged with saffron, proof of De Luca's tampering. You held them. That is indisputable. Harrington's smile collapsed. I only did what I was asked. Corbett promised influence. Armand promised reputation. I thought it harmless. Harmless, Wolfe thundered, his voice rising like a storm. You thought it harmless to shred reputations, to sow fear, to nearly drive a man from his livelihood. Foy, you are not harmless. You are vain, and vanity corrodes truth. The room crackled with the weight of his words. Duval clutched her gloves. De Luca glared at Harrington. Vukovich's jaw worked furiously. Armand and Corbett sat frozen, cornered animals realizing their trap had sprung on themselves. And the assault on Klein? I asked, breaking the silence. Who held the skewer? Wolfe's eyes turned to Corbett. His hand, or one paid by his hand. The scent of cigar betrayed him. He will deny it. But denial is brittle when the pattern is whole. Klein was meant to break first, to flee. He did not. That is why he was struck. But not killed, because fear was the dish, not murder. Corbett barked, You cannot prove this in court. I need not, Wolfe said. This is not a court. This is my house. And within it your guilt is plain. You may leave with your fortunes intact, perhaps, but your reputations are ashes. The critics will whisper. The patrons will know. The city will taste the sourness. That is justice enough. He let the silence stretch. Then softer, he added, And should you doubt that the law can be moved, consider. Inspector Kramer has already been informed. He will knock tomorrow. And he will ask why your signatures stain these ledgers. Corbett blanched, his cigar drooping. Armand rose, trembling. You ruin us all, for what? For a boy too weak to stand the heat of a kitchen. Wolfe's eyes flashed. For truth. For order. For the sanctity of this house which you fouled. And for the boy, yes, because innocence deserves defense against appetite's claws. The words hit like hammer blows. For a heartbeat nobody moved. Then De Luca let out a growl. Duval a sob, Harrington a mutter. Vukovich sneered but said nothing. Corbett and Armand sat hollow-eyed, their empire of schemes crumbling. I unlocked the door again, and they filed out one last time. Their footsteps were heavy, their voices hushed. No threats, no bravado. Just the sound of egos caving under weight. When the last of them was gone, I turned to Wolfe. He hadn't moved, but the tension had eased from his shoulders. He closed his eyes, folded his hands, and spoke with finality. Archie, appetite drove them. Appetite for fame, for power, for profit, for ink. And appetite consumes itself. They have devoured their own names. I leaned back, letting the words settle. And Klein? He will dine with Fritz until he regains his courage, Wolfe said. He may never cook for the city's elite, but he will live. That suffices. Fritz entered then, with beer for Wolfe and brandy for me. The house at last breathed again, its sanctity restored. Outside, the city pulsed with its endless hunger. Inside, the brownstone stood firm, untouched, unshaken, guarded by a man too large to move yet too sharp to be deceived. Wolfe lifted his glass. "To appetite restrained," he said. I raised mine. "And to cases cooked to perfection," he grunted. That was praise enough. The brownstone had a way of reclaiming itself after storms. The air, once clogged with voices and egos, returned to its steady rhythm. Fritz in the kitchen, the orchids breathing upstairs, the radiator hissing like an old friend. Even the leather of Wolfe's chair seemed to sigh with relief at the absence of outsiders. Yet the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of what had been unraveled, the residue of arrogance stripped bare. Klein remained under our roof, still fragile but steadying, his nerves soothed by Fritz's soups, and the quiet certainty that no masked figure would slip through the door, while Wolfe's bulk anchored the house. He looked at me with gratitude whenever I checked on him, though I wasn't sure if he realized the price Wolfe had paid in aggravation to keep him safe. For Wolfe, one lamb had disturbed the entire order of his sanctuary, and yet he had allowed it. That told me more than he'd ever admit. The morning after the final gathering, Inspector Kramer arrived. He didn't need summoning. He smelled scandal the way a hound smells blood. He barreled into the office, cigar smoke already thick around him. "Well, Wolfe, what's this I hear about financiers, critics, and chefs turning your place into a circus?" "Circus is generous," Wolfe muttered, not rising from his chair. "They came, they connived, they confessed." "That suffices," Kramer glared. "You expect me to swallow that?" "I need names, statements, evidence." Wolfe inclined his head toward me. "Archie will provide your notes. They are copious." I handed over the file I'd prepared. Details of the thefts, the tampering, the threats, the ledger with Corbett's signature, the confessions spoken too plainly to deny. Kramer flipped through, grunting like a man trying to chew gristle. "This won't make for clean charges," he said finally. "Sabotage, intimidation, maybe attempted assault. Not exactly the headlines I prefer." "You may dress it as you like," Wolfe said, "but do not dismiss it. They trespassed upon order. They will answer." Kramer scowled but pocketed the file. "You've made my life harder, Wolfe, again." Wolfe closed his eyes. "Then consider it exercise. You need it." Kramer stomped out, leaving smoke behind. I grinned. "You two should really get matching rings the way you spar." "Phooey," Wolfe said and reached for his beer. Days passed and the city digested the scandal. Whispers spread. That Corbett had overplayed his hand, that Armand's pen had gone dry, that Harrington's charm had cracked. Duval returned to her kitchen with dignity bruised but intact. DeLuca roared louder than ever, but cooked with new caution. And Vukovic's grin faltered in the press as critics questioned how close he had stood to the schemes. The chef's challenge, once trumpeted as a coronation, dwindled into a shadow of itself. The prestige soured. Klein, after a week under Wolfe's roof, found some color in his cheeks. One evening he approached Wolfe timidly. "I can't repay what you've done, sir." "You saved me." "I did nothing of the sort," Wolfe said without opening his eyes. "You were spared because others miscalculated. Thank your fortune, not me." But when Klein left the next morning, Fritz slipping a basket of provisions into his hands, Wolfe watched from the office window. His lips pressed tight, though I saw the faintest flicker of something softer. That evening, over roast duck, I pressed him. "Admit it, you cared." He set down his fork with deliberate precision. "Archie, do not mistake my defense of order for sentimental weakness. The boy represented innocence, and innocence is intolerably fragile. To protect it is not kindness, it is necessity." "Funny," I said. "Most men don't bother with necessities unless they pay in cash." Wolfe grunted. That was as close to concession as I'd ever get. As the case's echoes faded, the brownstone restored its sanctity. Outsiders no longer barged through the door. The orchids breathed undisturbed. Fritz cooked without interruption. and Wolfe returned to his books and his beer with the solemnity of a man reclaiming his throne. Yet something lingered, not just the memory of notes and threats, but the taste of human appetite left exposed. One night Wolfe spoke of it, his voice low as though confiding to the silence itself. "Archie, appetite is man's curse. It devours reason, it corrodes trust, it drives fools to ruin. Last week, I saw appetites dressed as artistry, as investment, as ambition. All hollow, all rancid." I leaned back, letting him speak. "They trespassed upon my house," he continued. "Not with knives or bullets, but with deceit. That is worse. A bullet kills clean. Deceit festers." "And you cut it out," I said. He shook his head slightly. "I exposed it. Cutting it out is the work of time. Their names will rot, their reputations decay. That is their punishment. My part is finished." I wrote it down later, knowing it was one of those rare lines he let slip that revealed more than he'd like. Weeks later, the newspapers printed small items. Corbett quietly withdrawing from ventures, Armand resigning her column, Harrington losing investors. Vukovich retreated into silence, Duval rebuilt. De Luca raged but endured. Klein opened a modest cafe far from the spotlight. The challenge was never held. It died in whispers, replaced by the next scandal the city demanded. Life in the brownstone resumed its rhythm, but I caught Wolfe glancing now and then at the space where the notes had sat. He never admitted it, but I think the trespass left a mark even he couldn't scrub clean. One night, as Fritz served cassoulet and the rain tapped the windows, Wolfe spoke again, almost to himself. "Appetite, Archie. It builds empires and it ruins them. Tonight we dine. Tomorrow another will starve. The balance is eternal." I raised my glass. "And we just keep writing the menu." He grunted, drank his beer, and let the silence fall again. That was the end of the curious affair of the chef's challenge. No bodies, no bullets, no gallows. But reputations shredded, ambitions burned, and order restored. Wolfe never left his chair, yet he bent them all to his will. And me? I wrote it down, as always, with my own seasoning of sarcasm, because in the end, the brownstone remained unshaken, Wolfe remained immovable, and justice, his kind of justice, was served hot, without garnish and final.